So good evening, everybody, and many thanks for coming along and being interested in this part of our programme, which is the bit that I get really passionate about and I'm really excited about. So hopefully you'll enjoy just seeing some of the work that we've been doing this year. So this is a fairly typical cartoon that you get to explain the hydrological cycle and how rivers work in less chalky catchments than ours. So you can see that a lot of it is based on things like what we call surface runoff. Obviously, the water cycle here, you can see that we have evaporation and transpiration coming from the ground up into the sky, and then we get the rain coming down and falling onto the land. And people tend to think of a river catchment as a basin, sometimes called a river basin. And the idea is that the catchment is any point at which if a raindrop falls, it will end up on this river. And that's how we think of river catchments generally. You can see that they also do in this cartoon do mention, as well as surface runoff, they talk about this through flow, which is where the water percolates in through the soil and then runs through the soil and still runs downhill over impervious subgeology. Now, they have included in this one, which is great, groundwater flow. A lot of them don't. From a lot of catchments and most of the ways that people think about rivers, this section here, this orange section here, is impermeable. It's clay or it's hard rock. And so there isn't much interaction between what's going on in here and in the rest of the catchment. In our catchments, in chalk streams, this is like a sponge. So water doesn't just land on the soil here and either run through the soil or run over the surface and into the river. It drips down into this sponge and then gradually comes back up. And what we call the water table, which if you can imagine, it's just a level of water along the sponge, that moves up and down depending on how much rain there has been or how much growth in the catchment there's been, because obviously plants will take up that water. The sort of pathways that the rainfall can take down through the chalk this is a fairly porous system, and it can sometimes go through big holes like what they call solution pipes. Sometimes it can be held in like a surface, like a wetland area, and then gradually percolate through. But there are also all these little tiny cracks and little, as I say, spongy material. So the water can come down and gradually start to fill up again as the rain increases the water in the groundwater. I've shamelessly nicked some of these cartoon sections from somebody's PhD, a guy called Timothy Grapes, and he's nicked them from other people's publications. But the idea here is that if we think about this groundwater level, which is this red line, obviously it should be blue, but I made it red so it was easier to see. When the groundwater level is higher than the river, the water will seep through the chalk into the river, often from underneath, but also from the sides, and the river level will rise. And that's what you see happening around this time of year. As we go through into spring and into the summer, plants and everything are taking up the water and the rainfall is reducing. The groundwater level drops, and then the stream starts to feed what we call the aquifer, which is this sponge below our feet. And particularly in our Winterbourne areas, eventually we get to the point where the groundwater is so low that the rivers don't have any water in them at all. And for our Winterbourne section, so those are the top areas of our streams, this is perfectly normal and we should expect it. What we saw in the last summer was those areas of what we call ephemeral streams, so the ones that are not permanent, so temporary streams, those were moving further down and down the catchments because we had so little water in the system. So what makes chalk streams particularly special? And again, I'm talking about sort of historically and in evolutionary terms. They're very high in minerals, so things like calcium and potassium and magnesium because of the way that the water filters back up through the rocks. But they're very low in what we call, or they were very low in what we call macronutrients. So those are things, predominantly things like nitrogen and phosphorus, sometimes dissolved organic carbon, the sort of things that you put in your garden to help your plants grow. And what makes the rivers special, our rivers special, is that a lot of the species have evolved in that system, and they are specialist species who can thrive in those low macronutrient conditions. And that means that we've got this real biodiversity that you don't see in other places, because sometimes you get these dominant species in these other systems where there are these high macronutrients. We've all heard the term gin clear water, beautiful to see. Historically, chalk streams have had these really stable water temperatures, which again favours these specialist species. They get used to these conditions. These stable water temperatures are what have led to the development of the water meadow systems, which allowed the soils to warm up quicker in the spring and for farmers to start growing things sooner. And also, as I said, we have this steady flow because we have this buffering effect of the chalk. So we don't get what we call spate rivers on these other more impermeable catchments. We're not getting the runoff coming straight into the river because it percolates down through the chalk. And that's what gives us these amazing iconic species. And this is courtesy of one of our scheme colleagues, Tracy, who took this absolutely amazing photograph of the very iconic ranunculus species that really is so characteristic of our chalk streams. Just to sort of highlight some of the things that are changing, and again, many of you know about these, we're starting to see a shift in these concentrations in macronutrients. We've been seeing them for a few decades now. And that shifts the balance to these bully species that can grow really fast and can really overtake from some of the specialist species that thrive in the low nutrient areas. It threatens to reduce the biodiversity. Historically, that particularly nitrogen is known to have come from changes in farming practices after the war, when the production of fertilizers became cheap. We used it a lot. We wanted to become much more self-sufficient in food, didn't realize what was happening. And in the rivers with the impermeable bases, they had problems much earlier than the chalk streams. But after a few decades, this nitrogen that had sifted down through into the groundwater, into our aquifers, is starting to come back up again now. And that's been happening for a few decades now. We thought that we were protected in terms of phosphorus because chalk binds with phosphate in particular. And we thought that that would mean that the phosphate wouldn't get down into the groundwater and then come back up. But all those little pathways, all those little sites that bind to the phosphate are now beginning to fill up. So the phosphate is getting down into the aquifer and starting to come back as well. And so that's giving us problems from the groundwater feed. On top of that, we have problems with the surface runoff because as we develop more through the countryside, we've got more and more hard surfaces, roads, buildings, etc. We also have degraded land where soils have been blown off. We also have septic tanks, and we all know about the story about sewage. So we're getting a lot of these macronutrients ending up in the rivers. But we're also getting a lot of sediments, which threatens that nice gin clear water and those nice clean gravels that we were talking about before. And this also stimulates much more erratic flows because we're getting that surface water element as well as the groundwater element coming through the rivers. We've also had problems with changes because of the physical modifications that man has made over the last few years, either for draining the wetlands so that we can start to grow crops. So we end up with, straight channels that flow much more quickly and are less filtered than they would have been when they were flowing through wetlands. And they have these straight forms to move the water off quickly because people wanted to have that dry land that they could grow crops on or put stock on. They introduce structures, weir structures, to control the water levels all the time, not just the ones in the water meadows, but also within the rivers themselves. And they isolate these really specialist species, and they also isolate populations like various trout populations, and that leads to genetic isolation, and that can lead to them being more prone to disease and things like that. But also, if they can't get out of an area that's drought, if they get washed out in a flood and they can't get back up, then you can end up denuding those species. And in particular, weirs and things will trap sediment behind them. And so you end up with like a lake of really slow flowing water and muddy bottom on your riverbank. And that's not the characteristic chalk streams that our species have developed to take advantage of. And then finally, we have both climate change and high water abstraction, which reduces the water availability, hence one of our other programs, which is, helping us to look at how we use water wisely. But these low flows can restrict movement for species up and down the rivers, but they also can cause higher water temperatures. And again, our species have all developed to have this nice stable water temperature that they've known historically. So I just want to talk about 4 of the projects that we developed this year. 3 of them, the first 3 that I'm going to talk about, are quite typical of Well, they're all quite typical of our headwaters, but in particular in terms of stakeholder engagement and developing the project. The first three are quite typical of where we are in the headwaters. We have lots of different landowners for each project. Perhaps we have a lot of stakeholders in terms of residents or other people that use the area. In the lower Test and Itchen, where my colleagues at Wessex Rivers Trust work, a lot of the constraints that they have on their work focuses around the fishing interest. And the one project that we worked on this year that incorporated that fishing interest was at Tichborne near Cheriton, on the Cheriton stream at the top of the Itchen. And I was exceedingly lucky because the angling interest there were very supportive of the project, but that's not always true for some of the other areas where commercial fishing is a big driver for the way they manage rivers in the lower reaches of the river. Okay, so if I talk about Flashetts first, Flashetts is a stretch of the river that runs through Overton up near the source of the Test. It's one of the very few areas where everybody has access to the river. It used to be owned by Portals, the big paper company. It's been bought by a group of landowners who are very keen to both maintain the access for everybody as much as possible, but are also really keen to try and address some of the issues that the river is experiencing at the moment. And they've been hugely supportive to us, which has been great. You can see here that the river is very, very overwide and very shallow, and the banks, particularly in the top left-hand picture, you can see this bank here has really been eroded. It probably should be back around here somewhere. The river is so shallow that fish can't really move up through it to get up to the better breeding grounds further upstream. This wood here, which is on the south bank, is shading the river really badly. It's a uniform age that's a lot of old sycamores and some ash, some diseased, unfortunately. So there's a very closed canopy there, which means that the river banks just don't have the chance to develop vegetation along. And when there isn't vegetation along the banks, any pressure that you get just exacerbates it because the vegetation helps to bind those river banks together. And you can see in the right-hand picture that it's very, very wide. You can't see the gravel in the bottom of here. It's just dropping sediment out. As the river slows down, the sediment just drops out. And we shouldn't be getting the sediment in the river, but when we do, you need those fast flows to move it along. And again, here you can see how the high footfall of people using the area is not only damaging the banks, it's also causing the trees to start to lose stability as well. So all our projects start with like a concept design. So this area here is that bit that I showed you that was very, very wide and shallow. This is an old mill. Previously, the fish were being drawn up here because this had depth in it, but they couldn't get any further upstream because of the mill here. So what we wanted to do was to increase depth and flow velocity coming through here. We call that an attractant flow, and that encourages the fish to migrate up into the higher reaches in the river. So we wanted to narrow the channel here. We wanted to still provide good access for people, but we wanted to armour the bank where that was happening. So we actually did that in two places to try and concentrate people's activity here. And then we wanted to increase the light getting into the river. So we felled some of the trees in that single age woodland, drop them into the river, which is a very common technique that we use. Sometimes we leave them attached to their roots so that they stay alive. So if we can't do that, then we stake them in so that they don't move and flow downstream and cause a flood risk. And that helps to trap sediment that's coming down. It becomes vegetated up. It makes the bank encroach outward. It provides fantastic habitat for juvenile fish and also for things like brook lamprey that like those silty margins. So that was the principles that we used for it. It was a very collaborative project. The Wild Trout Trust, who are our scheme partners, had made the original approaches to the landowners, and we chose them to project manage it, which meant that they coordinated all the contractors and did the site management and helped deliver, did deliver the project and helped us with getting volunteers involved. Wessex Rivers Trust provided various areas of support, particularly community engagement and some of the regulations and permissions that we needed. Sorry, this is an older slide. We should also have an acknowledgement for the Environment Agency, who stepped in and helped to fund some of this work because a lot of the costings had gone up hugely from our original estimates that were given to us by Wildcat Trust. So some of the challenges, very typical for these kind of projects that we do, not just the river, but some of the surrounding area is a triple SI, so there are extra protections and extra precautions that we have to take when we're working there. It's a conservation area, so we had to make sure that we complied with all of their requirements. Because we were using a lot of wood, we needed a felling licence from the Forestry Commission, so all members of the DEFRA family were involved. And then there was limited plant access, so you can see where that lorry's coming in. It's quite a tight area for him to deliver all that big load of gravel coming in. And actually just above the picture, there is a telecoms wire that he had to be very careful about avoiding. So we were lucky to have very skillful people involved in this. The beginning of the project, Nick was using contractors. So we had tree surgeons. We had this digger driver called Dave, it was like watching him manipulate a pair of tweezers with this thing. He was amazingly skillful. And you can see that we're starting to build the basis of the reinforcements for the bank there. And then later on in the project, once the chainsaws and the big machinery was gone, we were able to bring in the volunteers to help with some of the work. Now, just to give you sort of some progress pictures. So this is a fixed point. You can see it was extremely wide. We then used some of the felled timber to create that structure for the gravel bank. And then we started to build out the woody material here to narrow the channel and provide what we call this attractant flow. And from the same point, but looking upstream again, you can see before we did the works or just after we started the works, we have this really, really wide channel, no incentive for fish to come up here. And once they've gone up the other channel, they don't really go backwards. Trout aren't that smart. And this was immediately after the works when we were still in very low water. It's looking even better now. So we have got this flow coming up through here to try and draw the fish up into the better grounds further up. So this is how it started. And this is one of my favourite photos of how it's now looking. Not a fixed point, but you get the gist of how it's changed in character going down through the river. Second one I want to talk to you about is one in Andover, so an urban project. This is a project where a pond in the 1980s had been dug as part of a development for a sheltered housing estate. And the pond was obviously a part of the amenity for the area. But over time, it has become silted up to the point where, as you can see in the top right-hand picture, this summer, there was no water in it at all. It was just a mire of mud. And in fact, it had become a safety hazard for the residents because people could get stuck in it. And so it could cause a real danger. You can see from the bottom pictures, that's my colleagues from Wessex. The water depth there is really probably only 3 or 4 inches, but you can see that they're right up almost to their waists in the depth of this sediment. Although it starts out as trapping the sediment and being a bit of a benefit to the river almost, or to a certain extent, the river's not functioning as a chalk stream. It's too wide, it's too slow. It's not really a river, it's just a lake or a canal. And also over time, that sediment then becomes a source of sediment to the river downstream rather than rescuing it. And also because it's full of a lot of wildfowl, and there are water voles there, but there are probably also rats and things. All of those nutrients that are derived from that are then going to be fed down to the river. So we do what we like to say is taking the river offline, and we wanted to recreate a functioning chalk stream through the area. So we inherited some designs for this project. So the designs on the left were the ones we inherited, and we pretty much followed the concept of that, although we changed the way that it was delivered in the end. But we also extended the site to take in some other issues further downstream. So on the right-hand side where the red line, this is our extended area, and that was to incorporate some areas where the river banks had been built up with block revetment, so there was no natural riparian habitat going in there. And then also there was this very overwide channel down at the bottom here, so we wanted to narrow that and to try and recreate, as I say, this functioning chalk stream. And you can see the challenge that we had. This is the amount of silt that we needed to move. So basically we had 2 meters worth of silt that we needed to move, and we wanted to narrow the channel. So we wanted to change this big pond of muck from this into this channel. And we did that by incorporating a huge amount of gravel and using the silt that came out of here to build up the banks and narrow the channel in other areas. This is the revetment that I was talking about in the downstream reaches that we wanted to remove. Clearly, there's no sort of decent habitat there for water voles or anything, or, we like to see good sloping margins with vegetation on. So removing this kind of hard revetment is really beneficial for the river. Obviously, we couldn't do anything on this other bank because this is sheet piling that was holding the road up. You can see some of the challenges, even though we were working in the driest summer for a very long time. It was still a really hard job for the guys in the diggers. You can see that to a certain extent, they're moving soup around. We built a bypass channel so that none of the material from the works would enter the stream downstream of where we were working. And you can see the progression here of the main channel being built up by removing the silt and then filling in the holes with gravel. And as we were filling in the holes with gravel and also with the block revetment that we'd taken out the lower sections, we were then able to build up this riverbed all the way through. And this was it just immediately after we'd finished on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, once it started to fill up. And now this is fixed point photography. So this is where I showed you initially where Mike was standing in the deep silt. This was it immediately after construction. And this was it a couple of days ago now that we've got lots of water in there. So we're interested to see how it goes. It was difficult because it was so dry to get the dimensions exactly right, that it may be that we need to go back, put a little bit more wood in there to narrow the channel a bit more. But you can see that the river's starting to scour itself a really nice clean bed there as the flow has got enough energy to move that silt along. The vegetation itself will regrow very quickly because there's a good seed bed in there, and that will also start to encroach and narrow the channel. So we need to leave it, at least a year or a couple of years, and then if we need to tweak it further, then we can go back with volunteers to do that. So again, just before and after images of the site. The third one I want to talk to you about is in the village of Abbotts Ann at the top of the Pill Hill Brook. And so again, this is very typical of a lot of the projects that we do. The multiple landowners and the river runs through their gardens. So we have to be very careful, both not to worry them about any kind of flood risk, but also to make sure that they're happy with the finished product when we've done it. The issues we wanted to address, again, the river was very over wide and was picking up a lot of sediment from upstream, and the sediment was just falling out. And there are high nutrients obviously coming in, which we need to investigate further, and that was developing this algal bloom as well. So on the left-hand side, you can see part of the issues that we're trying to address. You can't see any gravel there at all. So again, concept design here was literally to add in some woody material on each side of the bank to narrow it and to start getting this sinuous channel, the way, a more natural form of the river coming through, and to push that sediment through and increase the marginal vegetation. As you could see in the last picture, you can see that there are a lot of hard revetments along the channel here, and again, not providing much in the way of any kind of habitat. Even on this side, these banks are quite high. So what we wanted to have was some nice low marginal habitat there. One of the constraints we had was that we didn't want to use willow, which is something we often use, because we didn't want it to regrow and cause a flood risk for the properties that are quite low lying to the water. So we needed to use hazel faggots, and we were very early in the season for the coppicing. It was only just starting and we couldn't get any decent transport, so we had to transport it ourselves, rammed into the back of this poor little van that I hired. We were very fortunate in that the landowners, as I say, were very supportive, and they provided us with spectacular welfare facilities. It's not normally like this for our volunteers when we're on site. But this was a very, very volunteer-driven site, and we really could not have done this job without our volunteers. We were there for the best part of 2 weeks. The volunteers worked amazingly hard, and we produced some great results. I think the volunteers all enjoyed it. We're going to go back next year because of permit constraints. We could only work on one bank this year, so we want to go back and finish it off next year. But you can see, again, this picture on the left-hand side, you can see how we're narrowing the channel to try and push that sediment through by incorporating these hazel faggot bundles, which will then start to collect the silt. We also planted those up with vegetation from other areas along the stream, and they will start to just naturalize that bank. Similarly, you can see that in the middle picture there. And we had a lot of very happy volunteers helping us for this project. And also even some of the Watercress and Winterbourne staff came along and helped, which was really good. It is quite physically demanding, but it's really, really rewarding because you can really see almost instant results in what's happening. So this was before we started. On the left-hand side, you can see all the sediment in the river. You can see how slow and sluggish it is. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that these gravels are really starting to clear up and you're getting that clean sweep through the river and you're getting back some of that natural sinuosity. And again, photograph was taken when the water levels were still very low. The water levels are now over this structure in that right-hand side picture. And we had really good feedback from the residents who said that they really appreciate how much more life and how much more vitality there was in the river after we'd done the work. And then the last one, I'm sorry, I'm a bit of a river nerd, so all of these pictures look different to me. So if you think they all look the same, I apologise. So this is the area where we were working with the Angling Club at Cheriton, or the Portsmouth Services Fly Fishing Association. This is a stretch of river that had been realigned by the Environment Agency in 2017. And although it had made a great improvement to what had been there before, there wasn't really enough energy in the river for it to develop the way that they had hoped. And we quite often find that with restoration projects, that you need to leave them a couple of years to see how the river responds to what you've done. The river there, again, was a little bit over wide. The bed form was very uniform, so it was very flat all the way along. And there was very little cover for any kind of fry in there. So we hadn't really seen much in the way of trout spawning activity, which was surprising in a river that is as beautiful and as clean as that. And the feeling was that really there wasn't enough cover for fry to be in there, and there maybe wasn't enough energy within the river to get the conditions that the trout needed to spawn in. So again, we were restricted here. We wanted to put in some trees along the banks to provide a little bit of shade and a little bit of cover for the fish, but we were restricted because of some SSSI regulations there, and also some farm payment agreements. So we stuck to just putting in river structures, but we wanted to make them open enough so that they could provide that refuge habitat for the young fish, but also tight enough to change the flow of the stream going through. And again, this was a very volunteer-driven project. We were only there for 3 days, and I think we put in, can't remember now, something like 13 structures. Guys worked exceedingly hard, and it was filthy weather, but very dramatic skies. Some of the members from the Portsmouth Fly Fishing Association came along and helped as well, but we had a mixture of volunteers from all sorts of areas, so it was really good. And then we also were lucky enough that one of the members from Portsmouth Services Fly Fishers was able to get access to a drone and took some photographs just showing the work from the air, which is always a really satisfying thing for us to see. And you can see how immediately that structure that we've put in there on the right-hand side here is trapping that sediment, is giving these lovely clean gravels coming round this bend, and will develop into a really good area. And I've had feedback from the fisheries manager there who says that the weed growth is much better than he was expecting. Some stats, which are probably not that interesting, but I think maybe the most interesting thing is the number of volunteer days that we managed to get, the amount of engagement we had with the wider community and with the number of landowners that we had engaged. The whole ethos of the Watercress and Winterbournes scheme of getting as many people involved, educated is possibly not the right word, but involved and enthused about our chalk streams is really helped by these kind of activities. And there will be more. So if anybody feels like they'd like to take out their frustrations by wielding a sledgehammer or knocking some posts into the riverbed, please do get in touch with us. These are just some comments that we got from some other people. And I just wanted to give a bit of a contrast here. This is a picture of some of the works that my colleagues were doing further down on the test about a month after I finished the project that I was doing. And you can see that the scale of the works that they're doing with these massive machines is really quite different. But the procedures and the principles are still the same. We're still trying to narrow the channel. We're still trying to undo the damage that's been done over decades of what we would think of as inappropriate management. And I think that's it for me. So thank you very much for listening.